You ever hear a man vanish? Not die. Not scream. Just disappear. 5 of them. I saw it happen. And the worst part? Whatever took them, it's still out there, watching. The campfire crackled softly, its embers glowing against the endless expanse of desert sand. The night was cold, unnaturally so, with a chill that seemed to crawl beneath your skin. Jake Burnur sat close to the flames, his shadow long and flickering across the jagged rocks surrounding the makeshift camp. His hands trembled slightly as he held a single dog tag, the metallic surface catching the firelight. His face, etched with lines of exhaustion and fear, carried a weight that no soldier's training could prepare them for. The stars above were sparse, their dim light swallowed by a heavy, starless void that hung like a curtain over the desert. It wasn't just dark, it was suffocating. The kind of darkness that pressed against your chest, making each breath feel heavier than the last. Jake's eyes darted to the horizon, scanning the shadows as if expecting something to emerge. He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the oppressive silence. "My name's Jake Burnur," he began, his voice low and rough. "I served in the U.S. Air Force. Helicopter pilot. Officer, I've seen a lot of things most people wouldn't believe. Combat, classified missions, stuff that keeps you awake at night. But none of it, not a damn thing, prepared me for what happened out there." The fire hissed as a stray ember leaped into the sand, and Jake flinched, his nerves raw. He drew in a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his hands still shook as he turned the dog tag over in his fingers. "It was Afghanistan," he continued, his voice steadying but still laced with unease. "We were sent out on a recovery mission. They said it was high-value tech, something that shouldn't have been out there. The kind of mission where you don't ask questions, you just do the job. We were supposed to pick it up, secure it, and get out. Simple." He paused, his gaze fixed on the fire as if he were seeing something far beyond the flames. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until he finally spoke again. But it wasn't simple. Not even close. Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, almost a whisper now. "When we got to the site, it was off. The air felt too cold, like walking into a freezer. The kind of cold that makes your bones ache. And then we saw it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint whistle of the desert wind. Jake's eyes flicked upward, scanning the darkness above, as if the memory alone could summon something from the void. "It was an orb," he said finally, his voice trembling. "About the size of a car, just hovering there. No sound, no movement, just floating like it didn't care about gravity. Its surface was like liquid metal, rippling and shifting in ways that didn't make sense. And the closer we got, the colder it felt." Jake's breathing quickened as he spoke, his words spilling out faster now, like a dam breaking. Every instinct I had told me to turn around, to leave it alone. But we couldn't. Orders are orders, right? So we kept moving. We had to secure it, whatever it was. And that's when it happened. He stopped, his jaw tightening as he stared into the flames. The firelight danced in his its light flickering against the endless darkness, as if daring it to come closer. The night seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening as Jake stared into the flames. Whatever had happened that night, it had left scars. No one said a word. It was like the air itself was holding its breath. And then we heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a low hum, almost like a vibration. But it wasn't coming from the orb. It was coming from the ground. He paused, his jaw tightening as he glanced around the dark desert, as if expecting the sound to return. The sand beneath our feet started to shift, tiny ripples, like something was moving just below the surface. One of the guys, Rodriguez, he whispered, "We need to go. Now." But none of us could move. We were stuck, like the air was too heavy to breathe. Jake's hands trembled as he clenched the dog tag tighter, his knuckles white. The orb, it started to glow, faint at first, like the light of a dying fire, but then it got brighter. The rippling on its surface became more violent, like it was alive, watching us, studying us. He shook his head, his voice filled with frustration and fear. And then it pulsed, just once, but it was enough to knock us off our feet. It was like a wave of energy slammed into us, no sound, just pressure. My ears popped, and when I opened my eyes, everything looked wrong. Jake's voice dropped, barely above a whisper now. The desert wasn't the same. The colors were off, like someone had drained them of life. The sand was gray, the sky was a sickly yellow, and the stars were gone. Just an empty void where they used to be. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as he relived the moment. We tried to regroup, but that's when the whispers started. Faint at first, like they were carried on the wind, but they grew louder. And it wasn't just random sounds, it was words, but not in any language I'd ever heard. It was like they were inside my head, clawing their way in. Jake's breathing quickened, his chest rising, falling as he fought to keep his composure. Rodriguez, he lost it, started screaming, clutching his head, saying something was inside his mind, tearing it apart. We tried to calm him down, but then he just stopped. His eyes went blank, and he collapsed. No pulse, no breathing. He was just gone. The fire crackled louder, as if in response to Jake's words, and he flinched, his eyes darting to the darkness beyond the camp. His voice grew softer, the weight of the memory bearing down on him. We didn't know what to do. Half the team was gone. The rest of us were falling apart, and that thing was still hovering there, pulsing like it was feeding off our fear. And then we saw them, the lights. Jake's voice caught in his throat, and he stared into the fire, his eyes hollow. Orbs, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the distance. They weren't just floating, they were moving, slowly, deliberately, like they were searching for something. And when they started coming toward us, we ran. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow and filled with regret. What else could we do? We were soldiers, trained for war, but this wasn't something you could fight. Bullets wouldn't work against something that wasn't even solid. So we ran, like scared kids in the dark. Jake's gaze flicked to the horizon, his voice trembling. But the desert wasn't the same anymore. The landscape kept shifting, like it was alive, trying to trap us. Every time we thought we were making progress, we ended up back where we started. And all the while, the orbs kept coming, getting closer and closer. He fell silent, his breathing uneven as he stared into the fire. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind and the crackle of the flames. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I don't know how he made it out, or why I was the only one who survived. But I know this, whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a machine. It was something else, something alive, and it's still out there, waiting for the next group of fools to stumble across it. The fire hissed, and Jake flinched, his eyes darting to the shadows once more. The desert was silent, but the weight of his story hung heavy in the air, an unspoken warning to anyone who dared to listen. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling as he pulled his jacket tighter against the desert chill. The silence around him felt oppressive, like the weight of the very memories he was about to share. "We didn't just run blindly," he said after a moment, his voice low and strained. "We had a plan, or at least we thought we did." The team regrouped, what was left of us, and decided to head for the extraction point. It wasn't far, clicks at most, but with every step we took, it felt like the desert was pushing back, like it didn't want us to leave. The firelight flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Jake stared at the flames, as if they might hold the answers he couldn't find. The air felt wrong, he continued, his tone quieter now. It was heavy, electric, like a storm was about to break. But the sky was still that sickly yellow, and the stars, they were just gone. We didn't talk much. No one wanted to admit how scared we were, but you could see it in their faces, the way their eyes darted around, the way their hands shook as they gripped their weapons. We were trained for a lot of things, but this wasn't in the manual. Jake's gaze drifted to the horizon, his expression distant. It started slow, just a faint hum in the distance, like the one we heard before. But this time, it didn't stay faint. It grew louder, stronger, vibrating through the ground until we could feel it in our bones. And then we saw them again, the orbs. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, as he fought to keep his composure. They weren't just floating in the distance this time. They were moving faster, darting between the dunes like they were alive. And the closer they got, the more we realized they weren't just lights. They had shapes inside them, shadows, faces. Jake's voice cracked, and he quickly looked away, his fingers digging into his knees. I saw Rodriguez's face in one of them, clear as day. His eyes were wide, terrified, like he was trapped in there, screaming for help but unable to make a sound. And he wasn't the only one. Every orb we saw had someone's face in it, faces we recognized. Our team, the ones we lost. The fire popped loudly, and Jake flinched, his breath hitching. One of the guys, Carter, he couldn't take it. He just lost it, dropped his rifle and started yelling, "They're still alive, we can save them." And before we could stop him, he ran straight toward one of the orbs. Jake's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. It didn't even hesitate. The orb moved so fast it was like a blur, and then Carter was gone. Just gone. No scream, no struggle. The orb swallowed him whole, and then it just floated there, like it was taunting us. He paused, his chest heaving, as he struggled to catch his breath. The rest of us didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran as fast as we could, but the orbs didn't stop. They followed us, getting closer and closer. And then the ground started to shift again. Jake's voice grew quieter, almost a whisper now. It was like the desert was alive, moving beneath our feet, pulling us back toward the ridge where we found the craft. The sand rippled like water, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't get any traction. It was like running in a nightmare, where no matter how fast you go, you're stuck in place. He took a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of the memory was too much to bear. We lost another man there, Davis. The sand opened up beneath him, and he just fell. We tried to pull him out. His voice was barely audible. By the time we made it to the extraction point, there were only 3 of us left. And the orbs, they didn't stop. They just hovered there, watching us, like they were deciding whether to let us go or take us too. He looked up, his hollow eyes meeting yours. And that's when I realized this wasn't just some alien tech. It wasn't just a machine. It was alive, and it was feeding on Yusin. Our fear, our lives, everything we were. And it wasn't going to stop. The fire hissed, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. And Jake flinched again, his eyes darting to the shadows beyond the campfire. The desert was silent, but the weight of his story hung heavy in the air, like a warning that couldn't be ignored. Jake's voice faltered as he stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his hollow, haunted eyes. The silence hung thick between his words, as if even the air around him was afraid to disturb the memory. We waited at the extraction point, but something wasn't right, he began, his voice trembling. The helicopter was supposed to be there. It was always on time, but all we could hear was static on the radio, and the hum was back. Louder this time. Closer. The two remaining soldiers, Wyatt and Miller, shifted uneasily. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes bloodshot, and their hands gripped their rifles like lifelines. They were no longer soldiers at that moment, just men desperate to survive. Jake's hand tightened around the dog tag in his palm, his knuckles white from the pressure. And then, Jake continued, the hum stopped. Just like that. Like someone flipped a switch, but the silence it left behind, it was worse. It wasn't the quiet of the desert. It was hollow, like the world had stopped breathing. The three men scanned the horizon, their breaths shallow and ragged. The stars were gone, swallowed by an unnatural darkness that seemed to press down on them from every direction. Jake's instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The orbs had returned. They weren't like before, he said, his voice cracking. They weren't darting around in games. They were organized, lined up in a row, like they were waiting for something, watching us, judging us. The men raised their rifles, but Jake knew it was pointless. Bullets couldn't hurt what wasn't really there. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think, to focus on anything but the suffocating fear clawing at his chest. Wyatt was the first to break. Jake admitted, his eyes darkening. He shouted at the orbs, called them cowards, and fired his entire clip into the darkness. The sound of gunfire echoed across the desert, but the orbs didn't move. Not at first. Jake's hands trembled as he recounted what happened next. One of the orbs shifted, gliding toward Wyatt like it had all the time in the world. He froze, his rifle falling from his hands as the light engulfed him. For a moment, I thought I saw his face inside it, screaming silently, just like the others. And then he was gone. Just gone. Jake paused, his breathing shallow and uneven. Miller and I didn't wait. We ran. We didn't have a plan. Didn't know where we were going, but we ran anyway. And the orbs, they followed us. The two men stumbled through the shifting sands, their boots sinking deeper with every step. The ground beneath them felt alive, rippling and undulating like a living thing. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers returned, weaving through their minds like a sinister melody. Miller tripped, Jake said, his voice breaking. I tried to help him, but the sand was pulling him down like it had a grip on him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror, and shouted, "Don't let them take me." But I couldn't save him. The sand swallowed him whole, and the last thing I saw was his hand reaching out before it disappeared. Jake's voice was barely a whisper now, the weight of his memories pressing down on him like a physical burden. I don't know how I made it out. Maybe they let me go. Maybe they wanted someone to tell the story. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. And when I finally collapsed, the sky was clear again. The stars were back, and the orbs were gone. He looked up, his hollow eyes meeting yours. But I know they're still out there, watching, waiting. And whatever they are, they're not done. The fire crackled softly, the sound almost too loud in the suffocating silence that followed Jake's words. The desert around you felt vast and empty, but his story made it feel smaller, like something was closing in. Jake leaned back, the dog tag slipping from his fingers as he stared into the flames, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. And that's the thing. he said, his voice trembling. It's not just the soldiers they took. It's not just the desert. It's the knowing. The knowing that there's something out there we can't fight, can't understand. And no matter where you go, no matter how far you run, find you. Jake sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the flames as though they held answers to the questions that had haunted him ever since that night. The firelight flickered, casting jagged shadows across his face, but the desert around him was darker than ever, as if the night itself had grown heavier. He tightened his grip on the dog tag, its edges digging into his palm. You think the desert is just sand and heat, Jake said, his voice low and hollow. You think it's empty, but it's not. It sees everything. It remembers everything. And what it remembers, it doesn't forgive. He exhaled slowly, the weight of his memories nearly crushing his words. The silence hung thick, as though the desert itself was listening. Jake shifted in his seat, his gaze lifting toward the horizon, where the darkness seemed to pulse like a living thing. After Miller, he began, swallowing hard. I kept moving. There was no other choice. The sand felt like it was dragging me down with every step, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them have me. Not like that. The whispers had followed him, faint but relentless, clawing at the edges of his mind. They weren't words he understood, just fragments, a language older than anything he'd ever heard, yet somehow familiar, like an ancient memory he couldn't quite place. The whispers weren't just sounds. They were feelings, fear, anger, hunger seeping into his thoughts. And then I saw it, Jake said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The craft, that thing they sent us to retrieve. It was there, waiting, just like before. But this time, it wasn't silent. The air around the craft shimmered, distorting the space like heat waves rising off asphalt. It emitted a low hum, not just a sound, but a vibration Jake could feel in his bones. The metallic surface rippled like liquid, and glowing symbols began to crawl across it, shifting and rearranging themselves in patterns that defied logic. It wasn't just a machine, Jake said, his voice trembling. It was alive. It knew I was there, and it wasn't done. Jake described how he approached the craft, his legs moving against his will as though the ground itself was pulling him closer. The symbols on the surface seemed to glow brighter with every step he took, their shapes twisting and shifting in ways that hurt his eyes to watch. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his chest, and the whispers became a deafening roar. I wanted to turn back, he admitted, his voice cracking. Every instinct in my body told me to run, but I couldn't. It had me. As he reached the craft, a blinding light erupted from its surface, forcing him to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the symbols were gone, replaced by something far more horrifying, a single, massive eye, glowing with a malevolent, otherworldly light. Jake froze, unable to look away as the eye stared into him, through him, as if peeling back every layer of his mind. It wasn't just looking at me, he said, his voice shaking. It was inside me, like it was ripping through my thoughts, my memories, everything I was. And then it spoke. Jake paused, his breath hitching as though the memory itself was suffocating him. Not with words, he clarified, his voice barely audible. With images, feeling. It showed me things I can't unsee. Worlds burning, skies filled with fire. And those orbs, they were everywhere, devouring everything, feeding, growing. The craft began to pulse, its light intensifying as the ground beneath Jake's feet began to shake. The sand around him shifted and churned, forming strange patterns that matched the glowing symbols on the craft's surface. He stumbled back, his body finally breaking free of whatever force had held him captive. And then it stopped, he said, his voice raw. The light, the hum, the whispers, all gone. The craft just disappeared, like it was never there. But the sand, Jake trailed off, his eyes flicking toward the ground. The sand was different. It wasn't just sand anymore. It was alive, moving, watching. And I knew whatever that thing was, it had left something behind. He looked back at the fire, his face pale and drawn. I don't know how long I wandered after that. Hours, maybe days. But when I finally found my way back to base, I knew something was wrong. The others could see it too. They looked at me like I was from dehydration. They tried to explain it away like it was nothing. But I knew the truth. I could feel it, even then. The base itself seemed different when Jake returned. The air felt heavier. Small things at first. Equipment failing without reason. Radios picking up static that wasn't static. And then, the dreams. He paused, his hand gripping the dog tag so tightly it left an imprint on his palm. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with images burned into my mind. The same symbols from the craft. The same glowing orbs. And always, that eye, watching. The dreams weren't just dreams, they were warnings. Jake began to notice patterns, connections he couldn't explain. Soldiers would disappear without a trace, their bunks left untouched. Strange claw marks appeared on walls and floors, identical to the ones he'd seen in the desert. And then there were the sounds. It started as whispers, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper itself. Just faint murmurs in the dead of night, but they grew louder. Closer, like they were coming from inside the walls, or inside our heads. Some of the soldiers claimed they saw shadows moving where there shouldn't be shadows, flickers of light that vanished as quickly as they appeared. One man swore he saw an orb hovering outside his window, its hollow eyes burning into his soul. He was found the next morning, trembling in a corner, muttering nonsense about the watchers. And then there was Daniels, Jake said, his jaw tightening. He was one of the toughest guys I knew. Nothing scared him. But one night he went out on patrol and never came back. When we symbols. The higher-ups ordered an investigation, but Jake knew it was just for show. They didn't want answers, they wanted control. The base went into lockdown, but it didn't matter. Whatever was out there or whatever had come back with Jake, it didn't care about fences or guards. We started losing men, Jake said, his voice hardening. Not to combat, not to anything we could see. They'd just vanish. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. Just gone. The whispers grew louder, more invasive, until they weren't just in their ears but in their minds. Jake could feel them clawing at his thoughts, planting seeds of fear and doubt. He started to question everything: his mission, his sanity, even his own identity. I wasn't the same, he admitted, his voice cracking. I could feel it inside me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. And the others, they knew. They could see it. They started avoiding me, like I was infected. And maybe I was. Jake's hand trembled as he ran it through his hair, his breath shaking. I tried to fight it, tried to hold on to who I was. But every day, it got harder. The dreams, the whispers, the things I saw when I closed my eyes. They weren't just memories. They were warnings. He looked up at the night sky, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. And then I realized it wasn't over. The craft, the symbols, the orbs, they weren't just in the desert. They were here. Jake's voice quivered, yet he pressed on, his eyes scanning the firelight as though the shadows themselves might betray him. It wasn't just me anymore, he whispered. It was the base. It was everyone. The thing, the presence that didn't stay in the desert. It followed us. The fire crackled, but the silence around Jake felt deafening. At first, I thought it was the UFO itself, that maybe we brought it back with us. But it wasn't the craft. The craft was just a tool, a lure. Whatever was behind it, whatever was controlling it, it was far worse. It wasn't just watching us, it was hunting us. Jake recounted the growing paranoia that consumed the base. Soldiers turned on one another, arguments erupting over the smallest things. Some men claimed to hear voices whispering their darkest fears, fueling distrust and anger. Others refused to sleep, terrified of what might come for them in the night. I'd sit in the barracks, Jake said, his voice low, watching the others pace like caged animals. Some tried to leave, to run, but they didn't get far. They'd come back hours later, disoriented, with no memory of where they'd been. And the ones who didn't come back, we never found them. Jake's hand clenched the dog tag so tightly that his knuckles turned white. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching, not outside, but inside. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling. I grabbed my flashlight and started searching, but there was nothing there. Just those damn symbols, glowing faintly like they were burned into the steel. He paused, his breathing uneven. That's when I realized it wasn't just the base, it was me. I could feel it, this thing, like it was waiting for me to break, to give in. The fear in Jake's voice was palpable, but it was laced with something else's simmering anger, a defiance that refused to be extinguished. I wasn't going to let it win, he said, not without a fight. He described how he started piecing together the clues, combing through mission reports, old files, anything that might explain what was happening. That's when he stumbled upon a classified document buried deep in the system, one that mentioned the craft and its energy signature. It wasn't just a machine, Jake explained. It was alive, and it wasn't just feeding on use, it was changing us, twisting us into something else. The document mentioned other incidents, other teams that had encountered similar crafts. The patterns were always the same: disappearances, paranoia, and then silence. Entire squads wiped out, their missions erased from the records. It was as if the military was trying to cover up the truth. I should have stopped there, Jake admitted, his voice heavy with regret. But I couldn't. I had to know more. I had to understand what we were dealing with. That's when he found the most chilling detail of all. A warning written in bold letters at the bottom of the document. Do not engage. Do not attempt recovery. Anomaly is through the ground like a pulse. His eyes darted toward the horizon, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The fire flickered, its light shrinking as if retreating from the unseen presence. "It's here," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. His hands instinctively gripped the dog tag tighter, his knuckles white with tension. The air around him felt heavier, almost suffocating, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. The hum morphed into a low, guttural vibration, one that seemed to crawl into Jake's mind and settle there like a living thing. He gritted his teeth, fighting against the overwhelming urge to run. And then he saw it. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, pulsating like a heartbeat. The light wasn't natural, it shifted and shimmered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the dunes. As it grew closer, Jake could make out the shape of the orbs, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. They moved in unison, their movements fluid and deliberate, as if guided by a single malevolent will. Jake's heart raced, his mind screaming at him to flee, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, caught between fear and defiance. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to remember the faces of his team, the men who had vanished without a trace. "I won't run," he muttered under his breath. Not this time. The orbs stopped just beyond the edge of the firelight, their glow casting long, flickering shadows. The hum faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against Jake like a physical weight. He could feel their presence, their eyes boring into him, stripping away every layer of his resolve. And then, without warning, they spoke. The voice wasn't a voice at all. It was a chorus of whispers, each word laced with an otherworldly resonance that made Jake's skin crawl. The language was incomprehensible, yet he understood its intent. It wasn't a warning. It was a message. "We are not done," the whispers said, their tone cold and emotionless. "You are marked." Jake's breath hitched, his mind racing as he tried to process the words. Marked? What did that mean? He glanced down at the dog tag in his hand, the metal now warm to the touch, as if reacting to the presence of the orbs. The whispers continued, their tone growing sharper, more insistent. "You cannot escape. You cannot hide. The Watchers see all." Jake's grip on the dog tag tightened, his jaw clenching as he forced himself to speak. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "Why are you doing this?" The orbs didn't respond immediately. They hovered in place, their glow intensifying as the fire behind Jake flickered and died, plunging the desert into darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Jake's ragged breathing. Finally, the whispers returned, their tone colder than ever. "You brought us here. Your war, your violence, your greed. You opened the door, and now we are here to collect." Jake's mind raced, fragments of memories flashing before his eyes, the mission, the craft, the symbols, the claw marks in the sand. It all made sense now. The orbs weren't just observers. They were predators, drawn to the chaos and destruction of war, feeding on the fear and pain it created. "You can't just take us," Jake said, his voice trembling but resolute. "We're not yours to take." The whispers fell silent, the air around Jake growing colder. And then, in a single chilling moment, the orbs moved closer, their glow enveloping him in an otherworldly light. Jake's vision blurred, his mind bombarded that he wasn't alone. The Watchers were still out there, hidden in the darkness, waiting for the next war, the next opportunity to feed. And Jake, he was just another mark,